Sergeant Daniel Cole kept the metal whistle in his gloved palm, warming it by degrees that barely counted. He had learned that bare metal could take skin in February. He watched the pen drift, men shifting to steel heat, and waited until the movement threatened to turn a line into a crowd. He raised the whistle and blew one sharp note. The sound cut through wind and wire. Detainees straightened and shuffled into formation where the lantern light was strongest. Private Mallory moved along the flank with his rifle, angled down but ready, eyes tracking hands and gaps. Corporal Henley opened the notebook on the table and wrote the time beside the first entry. The whistle was not a shout. It was a signal that bound bodies to a procedure and bound that procedure to a time stamp. Cole walked the front of the line at a measured pace and kept his hands visible as he issued the standard instructions, hands in the light, no shifting ranks, no passing items. If a man felt unwell, he raised a hand and waited to be addressed. Anything that happened after the whistle belonged to the record, and the record would be checked in daylight. Emil Varga stood in the back third of the line and tried to disappear. His gloves were oversized and stiff at the cuffs from sweat turned to ice. His hands were buried inside his sleeves, wrists crossed, fingers curled into tight hooks against his palms. He had done road and bridge approach work before he was taken, a job that taught men to endure numbness and hide weakness. In this pen, weakness was not only pain, it was classification. Henley began the count in a steady voice, calling names and tag descriptions. Each answer was brief. Mallory paused at intervals to scan sleeves and blankets. The rhythm kept the enclosure stable. It also pulled Emil forward, step by step, toward the lantern. When the count reached him, Cole's gaze settled on the sleeves pulled too far over the wrists. It was a small deviation, but small deviations were where contraband and flight began. Cole did not change his tone. He instructed Emil to show his hands. Emil hesitated a fraction, then drew his hands out slowly. The gloves resisted at the fingers. As his wrists entered the lantern spill, pale grains dropped from the glove cuffs and sleeve hems onto the frozen ground. They glittered once, then darkened as the lantern swung. Henley paused his reading. Mallory lifted his rifle a few degrees, not aimed but no longer at rest. Men nearby shifted their weight, and the line threatened to ripple. Cole raised an open hand, palm down, and the nearest movement stopped. He looked at the grains, then at Emil's cuffs. The grains were not soft snow. They were hard, like crushed ice mixed with fine grit. That did not make them dangerous. It made them uncertain, and uncertainty could not be ignored. Cole instructed Henley to mark an interruption and note the time. The pencil scratched loud in the cold, and a new line formed on the page that would outlast the night. Cole directed Emil to turn his hands over and hold them still. Emil complied, but the motion was stiff. His wrists trembled. The tremor was small, but it was continuous, and it did not match the brief movement of the lantern. Cole watched the way Emil could not fully extend his fingers inside the gloves. Cole did not touch him. Touch created disputes about force. Procedure gave authority without escalation. Cole instructed Emil to step out of the line into the clear space beside the table. Emil moved at once. The moment he left the bodies of the line, the wind found him harder. His boots slid on a glaze near the post and caught. The quick correction shook more grains free from his cuffs. Mallory's eyes followed the motion. The men in line watched and then looked away as if attention itself could be recorded. Cole signaled Mallory to keep the line steady and signaled Henley to resume the count with the next man. One detainee could not be allowed to stall the enclosure. The others needed to see that the routine continued. Emil stood beside the table with his hands held where the light could see them. Now that he was isolated, his shaking grew harder to hide. It started in his shoulders and ran down his arms, a shiver that did not stop. His fingertips felt thick and distant inside the gloves, numb in a way that made him afraid to look. Cole leaned in just far enough to see the glove seams and sleeve hems. He could smell damp wool turned sour by cold. He could see a faint sheen on Emil's skin that did not match exertion. Cole had seen the same look on men coming off night posts just before their bodies lost the fight to hold heat. Cole asked where the grit came from. Emil's eyes flicked to the ground, then to the line, then back. He did not answer quickly. Any answer connected him to tools, materials, or intent, and any connection could be written as risk. The pause stretched long enough to change the temperature of the moment. Cole treated the pause as information, not defiance. He needed a sequence of actions that could be defended, safety first, then medical if warranted. He made a decision that changed Emil's status without dragging the whole pen into panic. Cole directed Emil to move 10 paces to a fence post where the lantern light faded but did not vanish. He directed him to stand with his back to the wire, feet planted for traction, hands visible at shoulder height. The position prevented sudden movement and kept Emil within observation while the count finished. Henley opened a fresh page and wrote the custody change as controlled observation, then wrote the time again. The words were administrative, but they narrowed Emil's options instantly. Cole motioned to a nearby guard to shift half a step closer to Emil's post, not touching him, only tightening the boundary. He instructed the guard to watch Emil's hands and to watch the ground beneath the cuffs for anything that fell. He kept his voice low so it did not become a signal in itself. Henley, still counting, had to keep the cadence clean. A broken cadence invited the line to start talking, and talk in the dark turned into movement. Cole checked his own watch, matched the minute to Henley's entry, and felt the weight of what he had not done yet. A medical call might become necessary, but a formal call would ripple through the pen and demand another time-stamped signal. For now, he held to controlled observation and let the count finish so the next decision could be made inside the rules. Emil walked to the post and raised his hands as instructed. The fence behind him felt like ice through his coat. His breathing came tight and shallow, and he forced it down, afraid that any sign of weakness would be read as deceit. He understood, with a cold clarity that matched the wind, that he had been moved from anonymity into a process. Whatever happened next would be written, timed, and carried forward. Emil stood at the fence post with his hands raised and his wrists exposed. The wind hit him harder now that he was alone. His elbows burned, then went dull. Inside the gloves, his fingers felt like stones that no longer belonged to him. He forced his shoulders still, knowing that shaking looked like guilt as easily as cold. Cole approached at an angle that kept Emil in the lantern edge, but left Cole fully visible. He kept distance, no touch, no sudden reach. He watched breathing and posture first. The shiver was continuous, and the man's focus kept sliding back to the line as if the crowd could decide his fate. Cole instructed Emil to lower his hands a few inches so the cuffs and seams were clear. Emil complied stiffly. Hard grains fell from the glove edges and clicked on frozen mud. Cole crouched, pinched a few between gloved fingers, and rolled them. They were angular, mixed with dirt, not soft snow. He directed Emil to rotate one wrist. The cuff gaped for a moment. Cole saw pale skin with a faint blue rim and a damp inner layer that had turned stiff with ice at the edge of the sleeve. Cold exposure was no longer a guess. It was visible. Cole instructed Henley to note granular ice and grit at the cuffs and to note visible cold stress. Henley wrote the items and the time because the record needed facts, not opinions. Cole needed a safety explanation for the debris before he could justify moving Emil toward warmth. He instructed Emil to describe his work detail and what material could cling to sleeves in a frozen roadbed. Emil offered a clipped answer that avoided specifics, a worker's instinct to give only what could not be used against him. The pause and the vagueness made the enclosure feel tighter. Cole treated the answer as incomplete and shifted to a controlled inspection. He instructed Emil to keep palms outward and to use one thumb to pull the other glove cuff back slowly. Emil tried. The glove resisted and snapped back, spilling more grit. Mallory stepped a half pace closer to narrow the space without touching. Several heads in the line turned and then stilled when Cole raised an open hand, palm down. Cole made the first attempt to bring medical help in without surrendering control. He signaled a runner and instructed him to request a corpsman for a cold exposure evaluation at the pen, no transport yet, and to return with an estimated arrival time. The runner jogged into the dark, slid once on ice, and recovered. The stumble was a reminder that every minute was compromised by the ground itself. While the call moved through the cold, Cole continued the safety sequence. He instructed Emil to remove one glove under the lantern slowly, with hands kept visible. Emil peeled the glove with clumsy movements. When it finally came free, the exposed fingertips were waxy and gray at the tips, nails dulled, swelling uneven. Emil stared for a fraction and tried to close his hand as if will could force blood back. Cole did not grab him or raise his voice. He reduced options. He instructed Emil to keep the hand open and still in the light. Emil obeyed, trembling, the fingers refusing to straighten fully. More grit fell from the damp wool as he moved. Cole looked again at the debris and formed a plausible source. Crushed aggregate and dirt from frozen roadwork mixed with ice. Plausible was not proof, and proof would not come tonight. The only defensible path was to hold safety controls while formally creating a medical track that could absorb uncertainty. He instructed Henley to begin a separate entry for a potential medical emergency pending corpsman evaluation, and to note that the safety inspection remained in progress. The phrasing mattered. It allowed a later medical branch without pretending the security concerns had been ignored. Cole placed the removed glove on the table beside the notebook, fingers spread flat so the lantern could show its seams. He did not cut it open or shake it out. That kind of search would look like improvisation unless there was a clear trigger for it. Instead, he instructed Henley to note the glove was retained for later inspection if the morning sergeant required it. The decision did two things at once. It preserved a security option for review, and it prevented more handling that could worsen the exposed hand. Emil felt the attention narrowing and tried to reclaim control the only way he knew. He lowered the exposed hand a few inches and brushed at his sleeve with the gloved hand, a reflex to clear grit. In the lantern edge, it looked like erasing evidence. The guard at the post stepped in half a pace and raised a hand to stop the motion. Emil, startled, shifted his boot for balance. The boot skidded on ice. His shoulder touched the wire. The fence rattled, thin and sharp. Bodies in the line turned toward the sound. Someone in the back shifted to see, and the movement threatened to spread. Cole felt the enclosure tilt Disorder was not yet happening, but it was close enough that his next action would define the report. Cole walked 2 steps toward the line and made himself the focal point in full light. He issued a firm instruction for the line to hold position and for hands to remain visible. Guards mirrored the posture and widened stance. The immediate effect was measurable. The small wave of movement slowed and stopped. Men lowered their eyes. Breath steamed and vanished. Cole turned back to Emil and tightened the boundary instead of escalating force. He instructed the guard to move Emil 2 paces forward to ground with better traction and to keep the wire behind him at a distance. The repositioning reduced the chance of another rattle and made any sudden move less likely to be misread as a break for the fence. It also made Emil's custody unmistakable. Henley wrote the wire contact, the corrective repositioning, and the time. The writing did not accuse. It fixed sequence, and sequence was what the morning review would test. The runner returned breath hard and reported the corpsman was on the way, but delayed by ice and distance 10 minutes at least. 10 minutes in this wind was an interval with consequences. Cole needed to slow tissue loss without compromising visibility or control. He directed Mallory to bring a wool blanket from the supply stack and to hold it until Cole positioned it. Mallory returned with a blanket stiff with frost. Cole wrapped it around Emil's shoulders but kept the arms free and the exposed hand in the lantern. Warmth entered as a controlled resource, not a favor. Emil's shivering eased slightly, enough that his breathing steadied. Emil tried to offer a fuller explanation, describing crushed stone and frozen ruts, the kind of material that broke into grit and clung to damp cloth. The details were more coherent now, helped by the blanket and by the fact that concealment had failed. Cole listened and did not argue. He did not need a confession. He needed a chain of observable facts that could support a humane decision inside the rules. Cole instructed Emil to keep the exposed hand open until the corpsman arrived and to stop brushing at his sleeves. Emil held the hand still, fingers trembling less. Cole watched the wrist color, the fingertips, and the way the man kept glancing toward the whistle in Cole's palm, as if the next sound could turn the night into something permanent. Cole waited for the medical signature that would decide which branch of the record hardened by morning. Cole met him inside the lantern spill where the notebook lay open. The retained glove sat flat beside the entries. Cole kept his hands visible and indicated the scene as it was already held. The line in formation, guards on the flanks, Emil separated under observation at a fence post. Emil stood wrapped in a wool blanket, shoulders lowered but posture fixed by the guard's presence. His bare hand remained in the light, fingers spread as far as they would go. The fingertips were waxy and gray at the ends. He kept glancing at the metal whistle in Cole's palm as if the object could decide whether he became a problem or a patient. The corpsman did not step close at once. He scanned the line and the gate and measured whether treatment would create a gap. Medical care meant exposed skin and focused attention, and those were the same openings security watched for. Cole tightened control without heat. He signaled Mallory to keep the line facing forward and to stop unnecessary shifting. He instructed the nearest guard to give the corpsman space while maintaining distance from Emil, no contact unless Emil lost balance. The pen quieted into stillness that could be defended. The corpsman moved in and evaluated with economy. He looked at color and swelling, listened to breathing, and tested temperature at the wrist with the back of a gloved finger. He indicated immediate warming and wind protection were required. He also indicated he would not take Emil out of the pen unless the movement could be controlled and the destination could accept custody. Ice and darkness compressed the options. A stumble could look like a run for the gate. A rushed escort could look like force. Cole needed the medical track to exist on paper before he moved anyone. He asked the corpsman to acknowledge receipt of a cold exposure case for evaluation. The corpsman held back. A signature could bind him to a security decision while the debris at Emil's cuffs remained uncertain. Cole offered the record instead of argument. He angled the notebook so the corpsman could see the timed sequence already written. Initial whistle, count interruption, observed granular ice and grit, controlled separation, visible cold stress, retained glove, corrective repositioning after wire contact, blanket issued with hands kept visible. It showed restraint and continuity. The corpsman began a warming protocol that preserved accountability. He pulled a dry cloth from his bag and positioned it between wind and skin without wrapping the hand into concealment. He drew the blanket edge over the forearm while leaving the fingers visible. Care happened in the light, inside the perimeter. Emil tried to explain the grit again, now with fewer evasions. He tied it to crushed stone on approach roads and frozen ruts that ground aggregate into hard shards that clung to damp wool. The explanation sounded like work and weather. It did not solve the security question, but it reduced the sense of deliberate concealment. The corpsman's caution took a concrete form. He indicated he wanted Emil moved first into an isolation corner before he committed to any transport because a medical escort could not double as a search detail and he would not be responsible for hidden items. That preference would have reduced the corpsman's exposure, but it would have branded Emil as a security problem in front of the pen and would have extended his time in the wind. Cole answered by narrowing the steps instead of dismissing the concern. He pointed to the retained glove and the written debris entry as preserved evidence for morning inspection, and he made clear that any deeper search could be ordered later without delaying warming now. He shifted the table a few feet and had the guard rotate position, so a short corridor of lantern light led to the gate, keeping any movement visible and timed. The corpsman accepted the corridor as controlled space, but still withheld his initials until the pen fully settled. Minutes stretched. The line strained for warmth and began to drift. Men stamped feet in place. A cough traveled down the ranks. A guard glanced toward the gate as if measuring the delay. In the dark, ordinary motion could become rumor. The runner returned from the medical point with a second guard and a folded stretcher. The equipment implied urgency. Urgency without order could break the pen. The corpsman's evaluation reached a conclusion. He indicated serious cold injury and warned that continued exposure risked permanent loss of function. If Emil stayed at the fence post, the night could take his fingers. If Emil moved without a documented branch, the morning could write the movement as a security lapse. Fear pushed Emil back toward his old strategy. He tried to step toward the line, toward anonymity, toward the idea that if he rejoined the others, he could outlast the night without being marked. The guard blocked the movement with an open hand held at chest height. Emil checked himself, boots slipping on the glaze. His shoulder brushed the wire. The fence rattled, heads turned, bodies leaned a fraction. A gap opened and threatened to widen. The corpsman paused over the exposed hand. The runner froze with the stretcher half unfolded. The scene teetered between two narratives, a custody incident or a medical emergency. Cole did not grab Emil and did not shout. He used the one signal that could unify the enclosure without debate and could justify escalation as mandatory. He brought the metal whistle to his mouth, keeping glove between metal and skin, and blew. The second whistle did not ask for help, it demanded a signature. The note cut through wind and wire and snapped posture back into place. Guards widened their stances in practiced symmetry. Mallory stepped into the line's sight line and held a steady palm that meant hold position. Henley wrote the time at once, marking the second signal as an escalation trigger that transferred the scene from discretionary handling to fixed procedure. Cole used the regained stillness to lock the next steps. He directed the line to remain assembled and silent. He directed the gate post to prepare for controlled movement. He directed the flank guards to hold the formation until the gate closed. Uncertainty lost room to expand. Cole turned to the corpsman and positioned the notebook where an acknowledgment line was ready. He did not ask for a favor. He asked for the medical receipt that made the branch legitimate and traceable. The corpsman, now protected by a stabilized perimeter and a recorded sequence, took the pencil and initialed beside the entry indicating medical receipt and immediate warming measures. The mark changed Emil's status from suspect under inspection to patient under custody. With the initials in place, movement became lawful and visible. Cole directed the escort to form two on Emil's sides with the stretcher behind, and he directed the corpsman to remain close enough to monitor the hand without blocking the guard's view. The guards took short steps, testing ice before each weight shift. The tempo slowed, but it stayed controllable. Emil did not offer gratitude. Gratitude could not alter what had already been written. What changed in him was calculation. He stopped brushing at his sleeves and stopped hiding the numbness, because concealment had only tightened suspicion. The record, the time stamps, and the initials were now his only shield. He held the injured hand steady and let the escort move him step by careful step toward the medical point. As the gate opened, a gust drove ice grains sideways and made the lantern flare. Cole watched Emil pass through, blanket trailing, stretcher folded close, corpsman just behind, with the bag held tight. The pen did not surge after him, it held. Cole looked down at the notebook and saw what morning would demand: logical sequence, justified escalation, and consistent categorization. He had traded discretion for documentation and turned an impulse to help into a procedure that could be signed, reviewed, and carried forward without turning Emil into a permanent risk on paper. Emil Varga was brought in under escort and placed where the corpsman could work without turning his back on the door. The blanket stayed around his shoulders. His injured hand remained visible because custody rules and clinical rules overlapped in cold weather, and concealment could be mistaken for evasion. The corpsman began deliberate warming and checks that used simple tools and steady timing. He recorded the first findings on a form that carried Emil's tag information, the time of receipt, and his initials beside the word received. Sergeant Daniel Cole did not enter the treatment area. He stayed at the threshold where the escorts could still see him and where his notebook could still be read under the lamp. The night's decision had bought a branch, but the branch still had to bear weight in daylight. He watched the corpsman mark receipt and watched the escorts maintain positions that preserved space without aggression. As the first warming interval finished, the corpsman recorded improved color at the wrist and persistent dullness at the fingertips. He indicated that transport to a fuller facility would be preferable, but roads were still glassed over and vehicles were being prioritized for the forward push and ammunition runs. A second constraint arrived with morning. Limited movement meant longer observation on site, and longer observation could look like punishment unless the paperwork made its purpose explicit. A duty officer arrived after sunrise, boots leaving wet crescents on the floor. He took in the stretcher folded against a wall, the escort posture at the doorway, the corpsman's form, and the notebook Cole carried like equipment. He asked for sequence and for names to match the sequence because the review would turn on logic, not tone. Cole presented the record in the order it had been made. The entry began with the first whistle, then the interrupted count, then the observed granular ice and grit at cuffs, then controlled separation, then visible cold stress, then the retained glove placed on the table, then the wire contact and corrective repositioning, then the blanket issued with hands kept visible, then the corpsman arrival, then the initial medical receipt. The second whistle sat as a distinct timestamp with an escalation trigger note, followed by the corpsman initials and the ordered escort movement through the gate. The duty officer read without comment for several minutes. He compared times to the wall clock, then to the corpsman's form. He asked for the retained glove and examined it under better light. The cuff was stiff with ice and fine grit. He did not shake it or tear it. He noted its condition and directed that it be sealed for later inspection if needed, but he also directed that the medical branch remain primary unless new facts appeared. Security concerns were preserved for audit without being allowed to block warming and observation. The corpsman marked Emil as under medical observation with custody notation, not under punitive isolation. The escorts adjusted their stance in response. Rifles remained outside. Inside, hands rested at belts rather than on slings. Emil was moved to a cot closer to the stove, still in sight of the door, still logged, but no longer positioned like a man expected to bolt. The return of sensation came as pins and pressure rather than relief. It forced Emil to admit what he had been hiding. The corpsman required him to indicate function limits and pain changes at set intervals because treatment decisions depended on it. Emil answered with clipped phrases at first, then with steadier detail when he realized that withholding did not protect him here. The corpsman wrote what was said, and the act of writing turned the exchange into a record that could follow Emil without distortion. Mid-morning brought a focused look at the debris question. A military police sergeant arrived with a paper envelope and a small kit. He collected a sample from the sealed glove and compared it to grit tracked in on boots from outside the building and to material scraped from a nearby road edge. The comparison was simple but sufficient. The particles were consistent with crushed stone and frozen dirt, the kind that clung to damp wool near a churned roadbed. No hidden metal appeared, and nothing suggested a tool edge or sabotage. Emil was instructed to describe the kind of work he had done and where. He answered more fully now, anchoring the grit to approach roads and bridge works where aggregate was spread and then ground down by traffic into shards. His hands had been wet from handling frozen timbers and ropes, and the wet had turned to ice at the cuffs. The account matched the glove and matched the season. It did not change custody, but it cleaned the narrative. The duty officer updated the classification line on Emil's paperwork from a security irregularity to a medical priority with associated observation. The change altered what resources could be assigned. He authorized extra dry gloves and scheduled repeat checks at fixed times. He also ordered that Emil remain within a controlled area until Rhodes permitted transfer because custody did not disappear with a diagnosis. The balance was explicit: care within control, movement only when safe. Outside, the valley stayed hard. Vehicles moved slowly, and a truck reported sliding on a secondary track. That report reduced the chance of early transfer again. The medical point became a holding space where heat and documentation mattered as much as bandages. Cole remained on duty until late morning for the after-action review. He wrote a concise report that mirrored the notebook and referenced the timestamps. He described the second whistle as an escalation to restore enclosure stability and to formalize medical intervention, and he described the corpsman initials as the moment the case entered a medical chain of custody. He avoided speculation about intent. He recorded only what had been seen, ordered, and verified. When the review ended, Cole returned to the pen with the notebook and a clarified routine for the next night. The duty officer directed that visible cold stress would trigger an earlier medical call, but only after the line was stabilized and the custody boundary was marked. The guidance did not relax discipline. It made room for urgency inside discipline. That evening, before dark, Henley prepared a fresh page and copied the reminders in the margin. Time stamps at every change. Hands visible in lantern light. Separation positions chosen for traction, blanket use logged, medical receipt obtained before movement beyond the enclosure. Emil remained at the medical point through the afternoon, warming in stages and learning that the safest path through the system was not disappearance, but accurate categorization. He watched the corpsman mark times and initials, watched guards swap posts without entering the treatment area, and watched how each entry created a corridor of permission that did not exist before the ink. The record stopped being only a threat. It became a boundary against arbitrary labeling. By nightfall, pain in his fingers sharpened into something he could name. He indicated when sensation returned and when it faded, because those changes mattered. The corpsman recorded them and adjusted the intervals. The escorts noted each check and each supply issue. Nothing about it felt gentle. It felt controlled, and control was what kept him from being written into the wrong branch. Cole did not see Emil again that night, but the consequence of the case was present in the pen's posture. The line held straighter after the first whistle. Guards moved with less unnecessary prompting. When a man raised a hand for dizziness, Cole stabilized the enclosure first, then sent the runner, then wrote the time. Procedure made space for cold emergencies without turning them into disorder, and the record made that space durable enough to survive the morning.